The Australian housing crisis is going from bad to worse, with more and more people becoming homeless every day. And yet the government's mass migration program, which has been done against the wishes of most Australians, is just exacerbating the problem. If we continue down this path of immigration on steroids, then future generations of Australians will either live like battery hens or find themselves homeless. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Did you know that Darth Vader had a best friend and his name was Cooper? Why do you ask? Because he's forever calling out his name. Yo! I'll bring the tackiest jokes if you keep watching my content. Please take the time to like this video and be sure to subscribe if you'd like an independent perspective on the financial markets that affect all our lives. Now, why is Australia running one of the biggest migration programs on the planet when we're smack bang in the middle of a housing crisis? And what will it mean for our future if we continue down this path? First of all, it's very clear that we're in a housing crisis. Rental vacancy rates are at some of the worst levels ever in history, and there's no sign of any improvement. So the real reality of these low vacancy rates for renters is that they're one step away from homelessness, because all it takes is for a rental lease not to be renewed or for rents to be hiked up so much that the household can no longer afford it, and then suddenly those renters find themselves competing for very few other affordable rentals, and if they can't get something in time, they literally could find themselves out on the streets. And if you don't believe that, check out the footage of all these tents where people have had to start living along the Brisbane River in Queensland. Now, the really crazy thing is that while we're in the middle of this crisis, the government has been pushing a mass migration program by pushing every possible lever to ramp up immigration to record levels that are way above historical averages. One good thing is that more Australians are starting to speak up and calling for a reduction in immigration levels so that the housing supply can better meet the housing demand. AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver has been calling for a sensible reduction. Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business has been consistently warning about the dangers of this mass migration program. And recently, Australian icon Dick Smith has weighed into the conversation, so I'm going to focus on one of his recent interviews.
If we brought our immigration down to 70,000 a year, which is the long-term average, our population would level off at about 30 million, and that's what we should be doing.
Well, our current yearly net immigration level is around 500,000, so reducing that to 70,000 would be a massive reduction. Even if we halved our current immigration level to around 250,000, that would go a long way to start easing the overall demand for property, which at the moment is like a pressure cooker, with too many people competing for not enough properties.
By holding that position, as you do, that immigration numbers are almost 3 times too much, some of your critics will say you're racist.
Yes, it's got nothing to do with racism. It's just common sense. One day we'll have to stop growing, even if that's when we get to 1 billion people. We should be discussing it now, and my belief is we should stop the growth now if we want to have a quality of life for our children and grandchildren.
He's dead right about one thing. It's not at all racist to have a conversation about immigration levels. I'm a bloody third-generation immigrant, so there's no way that I could say that immigration is bad. But when hardworking Australians are having to live in bloody tents along the river, we most definitely should be able to talk about this topic. Because guess what? It's negatively affecting millions of people's lives, and it's a factor that's led to the destruction of real disposable income over the last decade, as can be seen by this graph. So no, it isn't racist, and yes, it's a conversation we have to have.
When I bought my house, Pip and myself, we bought a house that cost $32,000 in Sydney in 1970, and I think it was about 4 times the annual salary. Now it's over double or even more than that.
Dick Smith is spot on about the destruction of housing affordability. You see, back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, houses were actually very affordable in Australia. Now, Sydney's always been a bit more expensive, but most other capital cities during that period actually stayed around 3 times the average wage. And this can be seen by the research done by McCrindle when they looked at house prices and income from the early 1980s. So we've gone from about 3 times the the average wage to now closer to 8 times the average wage in most capital cities, and in Sydney it's around 13 times the average wage. Now it's not like we're a tiny country with a huge population like Hong Kong. We're one of the most spacious countries in the entire world. So why on earth is our housing so bloody expensive?
Young couples can't afford a house with a block of land where the kids can play in a cubby house. That's wrong. We should never have got into that situation where young couples are forced into high-rise like termites. The kids are no longer free-range kids like I was. You're a sort of a battery hen. I mean, we spend $50 million a year to get free-range chooks. What about our kids?
This is a great analogy from Dick Smith, but sadly, it does seem to reflect where we're headed. All the calls to fix the housing crisis seem to be saying to build more high-density, large apartment-type buildings to accommodate the massive increase in migrants and to create more affordable-type housing. But the sad reality is that a basic house on a decent block in the past was actually affordable, but to get that same affordability in today's housing market, all you get is a tiny unit in a large complex. So you are living like battery hens, you are living like termites, there's no real room to have children, and if you do, there's nowhere for them to play. So we're really giving a giant middle finger to future generations because we were able to have spacious, affordable housing, but they're gonna have to be caged up like battery hens and still pay a bloody fortune for it.
But Dick, that's a lovely thought.
Yep.
But is it a little bit old-fashioned?
No, it's not old-fashioned. In fact, I'll tell you what, 8 out of 10 Australians believe we should have a population plan.
Now, I'm not sure if it's 8 out of 10, but he's dead right that most Australians are interested in immigration and the majority would like immigration levels to be reduced. And you can see evidence of this from the following surveys completed over recent years.
Every Australian family has a population plan. Aussie family can have 20 kids in their lifetime. None do. They have 3 or 4 or 1 or 2, whatever they want, because they have the number of kids they can give a good life to. But our politicians have no equivalent plan for our country. They're letting us down.
He's right. Every family would come up with their own personal plan for how many children that they're going to have. And one of the big factors when families consider how many kids they're going to have is based on what they can afford to house their family. Now, it makes perfect bloody sense for the government to have a detailed immigration plan to make sure there's enough housing for all the new immigrants coming into the country. Because guess what? If there isn't enough housing, it will create extra demand for home buyers and for renters, which just makes the housing crisis exponentially worse. Now, because more and more Australians have been talking about the negative effects of mass migration, there could be some light in the tunnel. And I'd like to give a shout out to my subscribers because we've been talking about this issue for some time now, and I believe all your likes, comments and shares is making a genuine difference. An article that I saw just today states that the Albanese government readies to slash record immigration numbers to ease cost of living and housing pressures. According to this article, on Monday, the 11th of December, the government will announce a suite of measures designed to reduce immigration, focusing largely on cutting back the number of international students. In a statement to the Daily Telegraph, Prime Minister Albanese stated, "Over the past 12 months, we have put in place reforms to put downward pressure on migration to help bring net overseas migration back to what it was before the pandemic." Now, that's not going to be an easy feat because, as you can see from this graph, pre-pandemic levels were around 200,000 to 250,000. But with the recent exponential rise, it would take drastic action to get back to those levels within one financial year. So are we finally going to see a reduction in immigration levels to help ease this housing crisis and return the housing market to a more normalized state where first home buyers have more opportunities to buy a house and renters have more opportunities to find a rental? Or are we destined for a future where millions of Australians will be forced to live like battery hens, or even worse, live in a tent by the river? I'm Biko Konstantinos.